Her voice is echoed in my mind. I count the days till she is mine. Can't tell my friends 'cause they will laugh. I love a girl from senior class. Whoa, whoa. I daydream through my freshman half, but she fills out her college apps. I'll show her a world where we belong, but she'll have to drive us to the prom. That's what I go to school for, even though it is a real bore. You can call me crazy, she is so amazing. That's what I go to school for, even though it is a real bore. Girlfriends I've had plenty, she's the one that I need. That's what I go to school for. That's what I go to school for. Her boyfriend's just turning 19, but that doesn't bother me. He's back at college out of town. I find a reason to go round. I climb a tree outside her home to make sure that she's alone. She looks up and sees me there, still I can't help but stop and stare. That's what I go to school for, even though it is a real bore. You can call me crazy, she is so amazing. That's what I go to school for, even though it is a real bore. Girlfriends I've had plenty, she's the one that I need. That's what I go to school for.
Hello, friends! Welcome to week 8. I hope someone in this class is a Jonas Brothers fan and got that, because frankly, I'm not, and so I was really taking a gamble on whether or not someone would recognize that song. Welcome to week 8. I cannot tell you, I've been excited to teach this entire class. Don't get me wrong. I am super excited for this exact lecture. I love just straight administrative conversations. This is the stuff I nerd out about, the public management stuff I nerd out about. And so I think it's going to be a really good conversation today. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this preschool wage conversation that I had up here. So I think this is many of you have talked about in your reading responses, and I think even one of you is doing it for your final project, teacher pay, right? And I think it's a really good conversation to have, and I think that this, in particular, the conversation about preschool teacher wages, is an interesting little wrinkle in it, right? So, with the creation of the new universal pre-K program, we obviously have this additional state-sponsored 10 hours that every Colorado preschooler is going to be able to access, which comes with additional funding. The problem is that the funding levels is hard to determine whether or not you're going to actually be able to increase teacher pay with that additional funding. I think that this is not necessarily an article that has the most answers, but I think it is really, really informative to see the variety of different wages for preschool teachers across Colorado, right? So Boulder Valley, I mean, up to $50 an hour, and that's rough, but even the lowest paid is still $37 an hour, so really high. But then we're comparing that to something right next door in Westminster. Look at that. Westminster, we're looking at $25 an hour, even, and then we're in places like Pueblo down to $16 an hour, 21 as the median teacher pay, right? So the variety of this is really important, and these pay schedules are really difficult for administrators to work through and to create. So preschool teachers are not necessarily always going to be involved with the teachers unions. They obviously in many places are welcome to, but it's not something that they're always going to be involved in. And so those pay schedules, like we talked about, may affect them even if they're not super involved with the union. So something just to keep in mind if you are interested in those sort of conversations, subscribe to the Chalk Beat newsletter. I get those emails every morning. I love reading it with my coffee. I get my start with a cup of coffee and a really angry conversation about how underfunded our education system is. All right, let's talk about administrators this week. So this week we're talking about the role of school administrators. So we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to have most of the focus on superintendents and district administrators, but we're also going to talk about principals and school administrators as well. And then I'm splitting up their roles into 3 different buckets. This is not necessarily standard, but through my research, through the reading that I've done, I think that these 3 buckets kind of summarize the majority of the work that takes up a school administrator's day. And so operations and infrastructure, education services, and then finance. And we're going to talk specifically about that in the context of a finance election in Texas. Readings this week, Honed and Coburn, wow, that was hard, is the reading response for this week. Excellent article talking about the effect of policies on evidence-based actions taken by administrators. So go ahead and check that out. Lifto and Senden is a great book. I have it right here. It is a guide for administrators to run school finance elections. I've only assigned the introduction in the first chapter. Super easy, light reading, but super important. The school report card. Unfortunately, this is not a report card about how well they're doing in science class. Instead, this is a report card about how awful their infrastructure is. It's something that is prepared by professionals each and every year. We'll talk about it a little bit later. And then Hosford. Hosford is an excellent article that is going to, I think, speaks to, we're not going to have as much of a conversation about equity issues directly this week, but this is a really good article about how Black school administrators see school integration issues in the modern era. And it's also really good if you read it and kind of start understanding the methodology a little. It is a critical race theory writing. And so be thinking about that a little bit. Don't have to read it too closely right now, but when we get to our last week, when we're actually discussing critical race theory, I think that it'll be a really good one. It's actually a really good example of how critical race theory can be used in ed policy. And then, like I said, the reading response this week is for Honed and Coburn. So let's go ahead and get started. So the role of school administrators. We've got superintendents, principals, and administration staff. Most districts, at the district level, have a professional appointed administrator. We kind of talked about it last week, overseeing the day-to-day operations and administering education in the district. Like we talked about, superintendents is generally what they're called. They can also be called district managers or CEOs of schools. And in most cases, they are appointed by the elected school board and serves at the pleasure of the board. And what that means is that if the board, for any reason, wants to fire them, they can. It is part of that politics administration dichotomy. The way that we've set up that system allows the school board the flexibility to fire and hire at their whim, essentially, that peak administrator, but everyone else is supposed to be shielded from that political influence, right? Schools have varying varieties of administrators. Many of you are teachers, so this is going to probably bring up hopefully memories of 1 or 2 good administrators you may have had over your years, but many poor administrators, and if you're anything like my wife, really bad experiences interacting with school administrators. There's a variety of them. Principals, vice principals, deans of schools are typically the ones that you're going to see the most of. And then school level administrators are always hired by the district administration. School boards have no power in the hiring and firing of school level administrators, part of that politics administration dichotomy, right? So, what are these administrators? What should they be doing? What sort of background do they have? So, district level administrators are generally professionally trained in managing district operations, finance, and education. They are bound by, or should be bound, I should say, by professional ethics groups like the American Association of School Administrators, which is the National Superintendents Association. And then school boards kind of have a varying levels of expectations for what their superintendents should be doing. So some want a heavier focus on teaching experience, while others want experience in management from the public or even the private sector. Whether or not you're hiring based off of a management experience or a teaching experience or some combination therein, it's kind of the preference of the elected officials themselves. And in most states, they are required to have some teaching experience and or a teaching license, except in Colorado, Utah, and North Carolina. We'll talk a little bit about why that might be the case, but it is good to know that most states do require some teaching experience for superintendents. School level administrators, however, are generally professionally trained in education leadership. There isn't a national principals association that has the same power that the AASA does, but they are often required to be certified administrators through the state, which holds them accountable to a certain level. And then virtually all principals have some experience. Some surveys have found that generally around 5 years of in-classroom experience is expected for most principals. What I want you to be thinking about, though, as we talked about this, is that these requirements are different, and is that good? Why are these requirements different? What are we asking of superintendents that's different from principals? As we go along, keep that in the back of your head, and it'll be informative as we go forward. This is something that is just a straight management conversation. If you're ever having to design a job description, you're looking to hire someone, it is critical that you align your expectations to what the job is actually supposed to do. This is super straightforward, right? But it is also important for school boards and for district administrators to do the same thing. So, if a position is 100% managerial, shouldn't the experience of the applicants be 100% managerial? Now, there are practical questions you run into in a hiring conversation like that, but aligning that experience is going to get you the candidates that you're looking for. It may sound peculiar, but the general trend, especially in hiring district level administrators and superintendents, is that there's less and less impact on their teaching experience on their hiring. Generally, a lot of larger school districts are moving away from requiring any teaching experience at all. They'd much rather have someone with high-level managerial experience in the public or private sector. This may continue to extend further into principals, especially head principals. Those head principals often don't have a strong role or a strong presence in classroom instruction, whereas the vice and assistant principals may have more role in teacher oversight. But I do think it's really interesting because this is something that as I've researched this, as I was preparing this presentation, it was peculiar to me. It made me double take. Like, why would we not want our superintendents and our principals to have teaching experience? I mean, that's practically the service that they're providing, right? They're managing a bunch of teachers, they're managing education. So why is that not something we would require? But in general, the argument is that that's not what they're spending their time doing. Yeah, it's really cool, and I think it's got gives extra validity and extra gravitas to the person in that position if they're able to say, I did your position, I was a teacher for a while. But in terms of aligning those expectations, if a position's 100% managerial, you're not spending time in the classroom, do we care whether or not you have classroom experience? People are going to have very polarizing thoughts on that, so I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have any. Administrators are generally Just like with everything else, they have varying levels of responsibility depending on where you're looking. In general, though, there's three different buckets. So it's operations, educational services, and finance. Operations is the physical functioning of the buildings and the staff. It can encompass facility construction, maintenance, transportation, busing, personnel management, payroll, and all of the logistics for managing a school or a school district. Ed services is ensuring that curriculum is set and followed, selecting and preparing learning and teaching systems and technology, and ensuring that students are being properly treated, managed, and disciplined. And then the last level is finance. This is the preparation, execution, and management of the budget, which we talked a little bit about last week. Spending, revenues, obviously, and a proper reporting and management of grants and other requirements for state and federal funding. Just like elected officials, administrators have a lot of pressures put on them, but the pressures on school and district administrators are generally unique to their environments themselves. So some of the pressures they may see as political leadership. Superintendents especially are going to feel a lot of pressure as political dynamics change on their elected boards. Principals can also feel the changes, though it'll often come not from the school board themselves, but from their interactions with the community, whether or not the community sentiment and political dynamics of the community are changing. Speaking of those community dynamics, this is the socioeconomic and racial makeups of these communities. Whether they have the ability to fund programs, run schools, and provide education will depend on the amount of pressure they're receiving from engaged individuals in the community and whether or not the community dynamics and demographics align with that. How about parents, right? We haven't talked about parents yet. Parents are obviously the most influential non-governmental actors in education, and they influence the schools and the districts a ton. Voting, obviously a clear one, PTOs and PTAs, donations, volunteering their time, and of course, as Tibu would tell us, voting with their feet. And then finally, policy changes put a lot of pressures on administrators. Changes to state and federal policies put the onus on administrators to keep up with curriculum and state standards, reporting requirements, budget changes, etc. As we're going to talk about later, these reporting requirements are really important to know and to have locked down, because failing to meet one of these reporting requirements can cost you budget, it can cost you certifications, and it can even cost you your job. So, what exactly do these pressure points look like? Well, let's take some examples. So, political leadership. This is something that we've seen a lot lately. Douglas County Schools, they had a conservative wave of elected officials get appointed to their school board, and their then superintendent, Corey Wise, had implemented some equity and diversity measures, some DEI measures, and new board was appointed. They said, get rid of that. And he said, no, and he got fired. That is a reality for a lot of administrators, especially at the district level. What about community dynamics? This is going to be our case study, but forming a strong relationship with the community to garner support for ballot measures or new programs or anything like that is really important. How about parents? Go back to our very first lecture, the first videos that I was showing. Talking about parents showing up to meetings and putting pressure on administrators and on the elected officials themselves. There's a lot of different ways that they can influence the way that schools are run. And then policy changes. Honig and Coburn specifically talk about requiring administrators to justify all of their actions through evidence-based and research-based decisions. What that means is the subject of your reading response, but it is something that puts additional pressure on our administrators. So let's dig a little bit into these three different buckets of things that administrators do. So we're going to talk first about operations and infrastructure. So at this point, please go read the infrastructure report card. It is an easy read. It's not long. And it's honestly just a bunch of data saying like, hey, this is the amount of schools that need new HVAC systems and stuff like that. But it's really, really informative and I think really powerful to see just how many schools are in full disrepair. So this is the most practical responsibility of our school administrators, both at the district and school level. Decisions are constantly being made every day by these administrators to allow for a more efficient use of limited funds, more effective management strategies to achieve different educational outcomes, and accommodating different population or demographic changes. Do we have an influx of MLL students, multilingual learners? Do we have Are we in Adams 14 and we just had 1,500 students leave? We have to be able to manage that on a day-to-day basis. There are so many functional expectations on administrators. We will not be able to talk about them all. This is such a big deal that this is like why we send principals and superintendents to school specifically for this, because there's so much to talk about. I'm going to focus on 3 though. I'm going to talk about facilities, I'm going to talk about transportation, I'm going to talk about personnel. So let's talk first about facilities. 84,000 schools nationwide in 2021, nearly 100,000 buildings serving almost 57 million students by 2026. Districts have a ton of different facilities they need to worry about. Elementary, middle, and high schools, obviously. Alternative learning facilities, like alternative schools or technical training spaces. These can be if you went to a school that had maybe a shop class or a mechanics class. Those are different types of facilities that are necessary. Sports fields and stadiums are a big part of a lot of public schools in our country. Gyms, community centers, bus barns where we store all of our buses, administration buildings, and just owning land that's yet to be developed. What we're going to talk about, a couple of terms that I'm going to be using. The first is overhead. The cost of maintaining and operating these facilities on a day-to-day basis is what we call overhead. It is the general cost that flies over our head as we make other decisions. We always have to keep those costs in mind. This cost is constant and is often linearly or even exponentially linked to population growth. The more students we have, the more our overhead cost is going to increase. There's also another term that I will use interchangeably that I didn't write down here, but I'm also going to refer to capital projects. And so capital projects is a legal definition of facilities, essentially. So these are projects to construct, renovate, demolish, to interact with our facilities. These are our capital assets is what we would call them. And so these are, when I'm talking about facilities, I'm talking about capital projects in a lot of ways. So how do we do this? How do we handle it? Districts can obviously try to do it on their own, but they don't have a lot of money. And so there's a couple of different ways that they can choose to handle it. The first one is contracting. This is just sometimes hiring and maintaining, support staff is just too expensive. And so you go and hire a firm that's going to provide custodial services, that's going to provide maintenance, that's going to provide IT. And, instead of trying to hire those people out on your own, it can often save costs. But obviously, it will have some costs with it in terms of accountability and in terms of who they actually report to. They can also form partnerships. Partnerships can be a really useful, and they're becoming more and more common, as a way to try to share the cost of purchasing, constructing, or maintaining facilities by partnering with other governments like counties and municipalities to have use or cost sharing agreements for these facilities. The way that this would work is that you enter into an agreement that says, hey, we are going to build this facility and the municipality and county can use it for this particular purpose, such as voting, right? And so they're going to pay a certain amount of the cost to help kind of offset that because they're going to be using it. A super common way that this happens all the time is sharing sports fields. So you may have a football field that is the high school or the district football field that every student in the district uses, that's also used by the city's Parks and Rec department or county events. The use of those facilities, it's helped offset costs. It also makes these spaces multi-purpose, and I think makes for better uses of spaces. We're not duplicating services. We don't have 2 softball fields when we don't need 2 softball fields. And the final way you might handle this is through consolidation. We've talked a little bit about this. This is its own can of worms I don't even have time to really delve into, but it's fascinating stuff. So if you want to talk about it, I just talk about consolidation all day. But this is essentially, because I talked about, this exponential connection to population growth, right? There is always a base level cost that every district has to pay. Smaller districts just may not have the capacity to pay that overhead at all. or they may not have the facilities available. So what they will do is they'll undertake consolidation plans with other districts. There's a couple of different ways the consolidation can happen for school districts. The first is a functional consolidation where we share functions with another district. So two rural districts may share the same busing system, whereas they're still their own independent districts, or they may share an admin facility or share a sports facility, but are still their own separate entities. Then there's also complete consolidation, which is where you combine them together. We talked about the different types of school districts. Weld County RE7, Weld County RE4 are consolidated and reorganized districts, right? Those are districts that took two different areas and said, we can't individually, we cannot afford to provide the services we need to on our own. Combine together, combine those resources. It helps save costs. It helps provide better services. It helps us from preventing to duplicate our resources. And despite all of these clever tools, despite everything, for some reason, our infrastructure is still failing. Funding, right? There's just not enough money for it. Infrastructure report card is an expert prepared document. It is civil engineers. It is professionals within the field of school facility and school capital improvement. Reviewed the state of our infrastructure overall and gave us a D-. That is the grade you give someone when you just don't want them in your class anymore and don't want to deal with having to fail them. That is how bad our infrastructure is. 53% of schools need upgrades to their HVAC system. This is our air conditioning, ventilation, and heat, right? 1/3 use portable or mobile buildings that are either trailers or prefabricated buildings that sit on school property that put classrooms in there, put storage in there, and 45% of those are in poor condition as well. And then 65% of districts have not assessed their facility conditions in the last decade, or only 65% have assessed it. 16 never even thought about it, right? Insane that we have these facilities, we have this, and many districts are just not engaging with it whatsoever. I'm going to throw a bunch of alphabet soup at you now. So how do you handle operations maintenance with your facilities, right? Well, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, it's a professional organization within the federal government, recommends that the best way to do this is through the creation of an LRFP, a long-range financial plan. This allows you to completely and comprehensively assess and manage your capital improvement costs, or the cost to replace or renovate all your physical resources over time. 40% of districts don't have an LRFP to guide their action and upgrade their facilities. What an LRFP allows you to do is it allows you to have research, it allows you to have data to be able to say, this is what we need to do. What you do with an LRFP then, administrators will conduct a life cycle analysis and assess when facilities are going to come up for upgrades or replacements. You create a matrix that outlines all of your different capital assets, all of your different physical locations you have, and then all the different components of that need to be updated. Roofs, ventilation, air conditioning, technology, foundation, water systems, everything that goes into capital management will then have, this needs to be upgraded every 6 years, this needs to be upgraded every 8 years. You use that and to figure out what you're spending your capital assets on each and every year to make sure that you're keeping up with that. Keep in mind, if you do not have an LRFP, this life cycle analysis is damn near impossible. But all of this, regardless of whether or not you're conducting an LRFP, regardless of whether or not you're conducting a life cycle analysis, you always have an operations and maintenance cost, or an O&M cost. O&M makes up 88% when you combine it with payroll and you combine it with those other capital improvement costs. Makes up 88% of a given school district's budget. That is an insane amount of things. When you take those capital improvement costs from your LRFP, you take your O&M costs, and you take your payroll, combine it all together, you get what administrators will refer to as current operating expenditures, or COEs. It's the total cost to maintain the functioning of the district. 88% of a school district's budget is COE. Think about that. 9 out of every $10 that a district is spending is going towards operations, maintenance, and payroll. It's an insane amount of money that is being spent on this, and it's just something that we don't talk about enough. Administrators, though, have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. What are some other parts of our operations, though? Transportation is a huge one. Most districts provide some level of transportation services to their students, but, and this was shocking to me, only about 51% of students use public school transportation to attend school in 2019. In the mid-80s, it was around 60%, so this is a number that is declining. It's been declining pretty regularly. What is going to happen now with the influx of remote learning, with COVID, I'm not even sure if that data still exists. I wasn't able to find it. But what's going to happen from that, it's hard. The reason why we talk about transportation, the reason why I say most districts provide something, even though only about half of students are using it, is because every state has a compulsory attendance law, or you might also know these as truancy laws, right? It requires students to attend school, and the students or even the parents can be civilly or criminally charged if their students are not attending school. And because of this, there obviously has to be some sort of mechanism to account for when parents cannot get their children to school. That is where transportation comes in. Each state will set its own requirements about how districts are to provide some sort of busing system, how much of that's required. More rural states will have more lax busing requirements, and urban cities will also have super lax requirements. In terms of facilities, if we're going to keep talking about our capital assets, larger districts will have facilities that are colloquially known as bus barns. It's a place for all of your buses to hang out, where you store them, you maintain them, and you fuel them all in one place. It's really convenient for these districts to be able to have bus barns because it allows you to centralize all that, and it allows you to really coordinate how your busing system is being managed. It's a really a more effective way to manage your transportation assets. Smaller and rural districts don't have that capacity. Either they might not have enough buses for it, or they just don't have enough money to purchase and maintain something as comprehensive as a bus barn. So they might have to store their buses off-site or partner with municipal bus systems to provide that transportation requirement. Because of the broader dispersal of students in rural areas, however, they will end up paying more per pupil on transportation, even though they're not maintaining a bus barn. Rural districts have a really hard time with transportation and making sure that students are able to get to their schools. If you think about when we were talking about Native American boarding schools, one of the things that the people at Carlisle took advantage of with Native American boarding schools was the commute time it took to get to a centralized schooling location. That reality is still there for many rural schools and many rural students. Being able to get rural students to that centralized location costs a lot of money because they're so spread out. It is a massive problem for a lot of rural school districts, and is absolutely an entire field that needs more research, that needs more suggestions, more policy recommendations for those administrators. Urban school districts have problems with their transportation as well, just looks completely different. Urban school districts obviously have a higher concentration of students. They are centralized in one location more. So what they will do is they'll say, well, we will provide services to students who live outside of a certain parameter, about 1 or 2 miles perimeter. Within that bucket, whether it's 1 or 2 miles, students are responsible to get to school on their own. School districts have assessed, DPS does this, Aurora Public Schools does this, many urban school districts do this and say, well, if you live a mile away from your school, you should be able to walk a mile, right? What are the problems with that? Well, it gets cold. I think that's the first one. But also, there's equity problems with that, right? What about students that have different needs when it comes to transportation and mobility, right? Urban school districts may partner with their local transportation systems as well to help get students to school. So in my wife's district in Aurora, many of the students relied on the RTD system, relied on the busing system to get to school. That means they had to understand their bus schedules. They were not being picked up from a centralized location. They had to go to bus stops, and they were riding the bus with other individuals in the community. One other trend within a lot of urban districts is just getting rid of busing altogether. This is obviously only if state law allows you to get rid of it altogether, but the overhead for maintaining and operating a busing system is so incredibly concentrated that if it is a possibility and if district leaders can sell it, getting rid of busing systems is a really easy way to save a lot of money. Districts that have chosen to take this on, especially it's happening a lot in the Midwest and places like Iowa and Illinois. Districts trying to take this sort of thing on are also partnering with the municipality that maintains the roads and sidewalks and everything to create like safe walking corridors for students to be able to safely get to and from school. But eliminating busing altogether presents a lot of problems. I think about it as someone who was involved with a lot of extracurricular activities. How was I supposed to get to a competition or to an event if it wasn't for a bus? You know, when we're commuting all the way from South Colorado Springs to Greeley for an event, how are we supposed to get there if our district has completely eliminated our busing, right? So other considerations to have, and administrators have to take this all into consideration, and making the hard decision of getting rid of your busing is something that many administrators are feeling like they have to do because of their cost restrictions. Personnel, man, this is another one that you need an entire class, if not an entire program dedicated to personnel management. And we're going to talk about teacher pay next week when we actually talk about teachers. But I think that there's been less focus on management of our personnel and our teachers than there has been on the pay of the teachers, which is obviously for good reason, right? We would need to be paying our teachers more. But managing their personnel is a huge role that administrators have. Things like where you're physically going to put your personnel is a problem. Sometimes school administrators will have more teachers than they have classrooms, and so they create what are called roaming teachers. Roaming teachers are teachers without a home classroom where they teach their set of classes from different people's classrooms over the course of the day. It is actually, as someone who has not taught and worked out of a roaming classroom sort of situation, it is actually a really efficient way to use your space, because what you're doing is you're maximizing the use of your rooms. You're minimizing the amount of rooms that are sitting idle on any given space. It's a really efficient way when you're just looking at it from a straight data and quantitative perspective. But what about the teachers that have to give up their classroom? Where are they supposed to spend their planning periods? What about the teachers that don't have a home classroom? Where are they supposed to spend their time when they're not in someone else's classroom? Also, there's equity issues. Are the teachers being assigned to roaming, are they younger? Are they less experienced? And are they generally people of color? All things that are a part of that. Another thing is that if you don't have enough classrooms, well, you're going to purchase mobiles. Mobiles are these prefab buildings, the trailers that sit on school property, and you're going to put some teachers out there. My wife taught out of a mobile for last year. And what is really convenient for costs about mobiles is that state municipal codes will often have more relaxed requirements in terms of constructing and maintaining these mobile prefab buildings. HVAC, air conditioning, filtration, insulation, and construction are all less. So the cost, the overhead is not as much as it would be to build an entire new wing onto an existing school building. Obviously, having worse air filtration and HVAC and insulation has its own problems, but if we're looking at it from a pure cost perspective, if you're assessing two different options as an administrator, and both are going to be able to provide the education services to your student, and one's significantly cheaper, that's a consideration you're going to have to make. That's a hard decision you'd have to make as an administrator. And then administrators also have to monitor and evaluate their personnel. Obviously, the schemes for evaluating personnel may place a heavier emphasis on standardized testing and student performance, but administrative monitoring and evaluation of teacher performance is becoming something that more and more small p progressive schools and school districts are leaning towards to provide a more holistic evaluation of teacher performance than just looking at test scores. But coming back to one of our greater topics in this class, test scores, student performance is way more measurable. It is way easier for you to compare two teachers if you're just looking at their test scores than if you're getting the subjective analysis from the administrator on how you believe that teacher handled the class. It's always preferable. It's easier to compare, but that does not mean it's the most equitable or most fair way to assess your personnel's performance. So, just some guiding questions as we think about operations and facilities. It is an ongoing issue. It represents 88% of any district's, or of the average district's budget. And yet funding is continuing to go down. The report card indicated that almost funding for capital projects and operations and management decreased to about 1/3 over the course of the decade from 2008 to 2017. Administrators, because of that restriction, often have to be more focused on keeping schools open and functioning than they are spending the time and money on creating proactive and preventative programs to maintain and improve facilities, such as conducting LRFPs and creating life cycle analyses. Poor facilities also have a direct negative impact on student performance, staff recruiting and staff performance, and community, student, and staff health. The quality of our facilities is critical to the performance of our students, and yet it is one of the places that administrators spend the most of their time and get the least amount of money for. Some issues with operations and facilities, there are so many. Project I worked on analyzing school infrastructure on the whole, talked a lot of I found kind of these as the operations and facilities topics that were most prevalent, that came up a lot. Effects of diesel emissions on students, so this is regarding busing. Diesel emissions have been shown to have a really acute impact on student health, and so if your buses run on diesel, it is directly impacting the health of your students who ride the bus. Performance evaluation, this is something that we talked about in one of our introductions. The state is changing their performance evaluation scheme for teachers. The use of mobile classrooms to accommodate growth. The provision of clean water and air filtration, especially in poor schools. There's a story that I like to tell about Detroit Public Schools where a certain segment of Detroit Public Schools water piping systems fell into such disrepair that the city made them shut it off on the first day of school. So there was literally no water in multiple school buildings in Detroit during one of the most hectic days of school of the year. And that's something that not providing that preventative maintenance, not conducting those LRFPs and creating a plan for operating your assets can have really acute consequences. Right? And then air conditioning and central heating in the climates that need them the most is something that we're running into, especially as places like the Southwest and the South get hotter. Making sure that schools have air conditioning is really hard because air conditioning is expensive to not only install but also to operate on a day-to-day basis. I'd also love to hear, especially from those of you with experience teaching in the classroom, but from everyone's experience from their own education background, what sort of facilities and operations do you have to deal with? I know that my school did not have AC, but we had heating, and the heating was always turned on when it shouldn't have been. It always stayed on way later into the spring than it needed to. And so, and that's the sort of stuff that sticks with me as a former student, right? That was an experience that I remember. And that obviously is going to push out something else that was probably more critical to my learning experience. What about education services? This one's going to be a little bit shorter. Operations is I've spent a lot of time researching that, but education services is very important. This is the product, right? If we go back to our analogy of schools as factories, what they're pushing out is the education, right? This is the physical product that they're creating, right? Administrators have a certain bucket of roles that they play in education service provision, beyond just evaluating teacher performance. We're going to get really detailed into how policy and administrative decisions affect teachers next week. But this week, we're going to speak to 3 broad buckets of education services that administrators, particularly school level administrators, have to deal with. And it's federal and state reporting requirements, curriculum, and student management. So first, reporting requirements. This is something that is really boring to think about, and it's not something that's really sexy that's going to get reported in something like Chalkbeat or even the Denver Post, but this is a huge amount of time that district central offices and school administrators have to spend their time doing. Policy setting education standards, as well as grants and funding received from federal and state governments, have strict reporting requirements for schools. This reporting can be attendance reporting. It can be test score reporting through things like the No Child Left Behind Act. It can be teacher evaluation reporting required for many teacher certification systems. And demographic reporting for things under something like federal civil rights law, that they have to report what their demographics look like. Missing any of these reporting requirements can be devastating for funding and school certification. For example, missing a demographic reporting under federal civil rights law can lead to federal litigation being pressed against your district or your school for violating civil rights law. That is terrible. Failing to report test scores can negatively impact your ability to receive funding from the state and federal government. Grants will have their own unique requirements to report that are going to be different from even similar grants reported or given out at the same time. And so entire staff divisions and people within finance offices at district central offices and at the school administrative level have to spend their time making sure that they fully understand what these reporting requirements are and how they're going to comply with them. Curriculum. States. This is something that I think I want to emphasize. So the use of curriculum is different in different ways. So curriculum we were talking about before is states set curriculum. What we're really talking about is states setting their academic standards. What needs to be learned, what should be learned by each student at each age level in each core area. Most states follow Common Core, Lightning Crash. If I had video editing experience, every time I said Common Core, it would like Lightning Crash. That's not something I can do. But that's how they set those academic standards. Districts are then responsible for determining how they're going to meet those standards. Administrators have to weigh a lot of different considerations in meeting those requirements, such as how much flexibility do you want to give your teachers in providing that education? What are the reporting requirements, and are they specific tests? Are they specific outcomes, measurements that we have to have that's going to change the way we provide our services? And how do we evaluate our teachers? Is it something that we can use jointly to both assess our academic performance of our students and our teachers? And consistency. Are we constantly changing what we're teaching so that we don't have a lot of good comparison from year to year about how students are performing? One of the ways you get through this is that administrators will select pre-constructed curricular plans that will outline the curriculum for teachers to follow to meet academic standards. There's a couple of different ways these plans can look, but in general, you're going to categorize them by the levels of flexibility that they provide teachers. One of the more flexible options is a set performance task curricula that just sets the end goals, what you're supposed to get to at each unit, and then teachers are essentially given the flexibility to meet that level to some extent. You may have inclusive curricula that includes all of the resources and but doesn't direct teachers as to how they should be using it, and scripted curricula. And scripted will dictate what, when, and how all aspects of a class are taught. This is a really important decision for administrators to make, because not only does it affect your student performance, your reporting, but it also impacts your teachers directly. And if you do not have a happy, successful, professional teaching force behind your schools, you're never going to meet your academic standards. And remember when we talked about McGraw-Hill and Pearson and all these private companies that are like doing all these things to control our education system? Well, guess what? Curriculum is another way in which they're doing all these things to control our education system. Private companies that create those tests also create the curriculum that teaches to those tests. They will create these pre-constructed curricula and sell them to districts, and often lot those districts into plans over the course of years, and contracts that they have to follow and pay out of, or pay a lot of money to McGraw-Hill or Pearson to break those contracts. Aurora Public Schools, where my wife taught, entered into a 5-year plan with Study Sync, which was a McGraw-Hill curriculum plan that was incredibly scripted, that provided specific resources for each and every unit for their English teachers to follow. They entered into a 5-year contract without consulting any of the English teachers in the district that would be affected by it. This curriculum was highly scripted, meaning that teachers like my wife were not able to have the power to alter assignments, readings, etc. And one of the most frustrating parts of these highly scripted curriculums, even though they're really measurable and they're really easy, is that there's no flexibility, not just for teachers to be able to do their job the way they want, but also to differentiate to meet the needs of their students. Multilingual learners. Language barriers are often a problem. With Study Sync in particular, my wife was telling me that there were resources for Spanish-speaking students and nothing else. So students that spoke a variation of Spanish that wasn't aligned with what they were providing, or any other home language that wasn't a part of it, there were no resources for that. Students with individualized education plans, or IEPs, so if they have special needs such as having tests read to them out loud or anything like that, may not be incorporated as part of these curriculums. And as well as other students with specialized needs, such as if they're hearing or visually impaired, if they have processing issues, anything like that, there's just no flexibility in these highly scripted curricula to provide those services to those students with specific needs. Again, this is a trade-off. This is a tension that we see in that administrators have to deal with it all the time. We need to be able to measure student performance and measure teacher performance, but we also need to be able to provide education to every student in the way that they need. And something like a scripted curriculum is something that chooses one side of that tension over the other very clearly. And then finally, student management. This is something that in some of your personal school retrospectives you talked about. But the management of students is really important decision, especially for school level administrators. Setting academic calendars is a huge decision. So the calendars are not only tools that set when holidays happen, when testing happens, other events like proms and football games and everything like that. Those are often set to meet the reporting requirements for the grants and for the state and federal policies that they have to follow. And it also allows teachers to plan their courses. But these calendars may change from year to year depending on if those reporting requirements change. But those academic calendars are a really, really important tool. The physical placement and movement of students is also something that goes pretty overlooked, but is a massive part of how school administrators function. How long students have to get from class to class and where any particular class is located is a decision that affects your educational outcomes. Finally, student discipline. Discipline is often left to school administrative offices as well. Many schools will hire specific positions to handle discipline, such as deans of students for discipline. That's how my high school functioned. That's how a lot of schools choose to function, have some positions dedicated to discipline alone. We're also, as we've talked about, very aware that the role that school resource officers, SROs, these police officers, either privately hired or hired by the local police department, play in discipline, often citing and even arresting students for incidents in and around their schools. But discipline becomes a really important part of how, especially principals and school level administrators, create the learning environment and management philosophies for their schools. Traditional discipline comes from a school of management philosophy that kind of falls into the bucket of what we would call command and control schemes, where you have one person in charge that commands everything and controls the way that people behave. And these schemes often prioritize disciplinary action to ensure specific outcomes. They want people, or they want their students and their teachers to follow the rules that they set out so that they have control over the outcomes and the product that's coming out. And it also, in these schemes, which a lot of schools are still following to this day, it gives a lot of power to those disciplining students, the administrators, the SROs. But there has been much research done on this field, and unsurprisingly, these longitudinal long-term studies revealed that there is a disproportionalized racialized enforcement of school discipline. 2014, for example, Black students made up about 16% of the national school body, but accounted for 40% of all suspensions for schools. This is a decision being made by administrators. We can have a conversation about whether or not these policies are explicitly racist or just implicitly racist. But regardless of the explicit or implicit goal, the outcome was racialized. It did have a disproportionate impact on students of color, particularly Black students. And so the decisions that administrators are making are creating that. Sometimes administrators will make an intentional decision to punish Black students more. It may not be as crass as I say it right there, but those decisions are being made intentionally. But sometimes there's just an unintentional effect of, well, maybe you're going to focus your discipline on attendance, for example, but the poor members of the poor students in your school are generally students of color, and they're the ones that are going to have a harder time getting to school on time. Therefore, the consequence of that is a racialized effect and a racialized outcome. These are all decisions that administrators make, and it all goes into the different things that they have to consider when they're managing their schools. Some guiding questions just to think about educational services. Most of the money goes into operation, the purpose really falls into education services. Administrators have to comply and meet state standards, have a deep knowledge of best practices in education of every subject, and they may not have that. Administrators may be trained in leadership and management and just don't have that educational experience, or they have a lot of educational experience and no management experience. This is a tension, and this is a problem that occurs for administrators everywhere, and it makes their jobs harder. So think about what role administrators play in education services, whether that's too big or too small, and what are the considerations that administrators are taking are making when discussing different things such as curriculum. Why is the decision so critical, and how does it impact all of these different groups within a school or a district themselves? And finally, equity has reared its ugly head again, right? We're once again talking to equity. So be thinking about what are those through lines that we can, those broader equity conversations, Brown v. Board of Education, those Native American boarding schools, to discussions in management with things like discipline. What are those through lines? How can we make those connections? They're there. This is a trend. This is a systemic issue in our education system that goes all the way from our history and our federal policies all the way down to the effect of students on a day-to-day basis. All right. So I am going to try to get through this. I will explain at the end why this may be hard, but I'm going to I may have to take a second to talk about this case study. But let's talk about finance. So at this point, please make sure you've read Leafto and Senden. Again, super easy reading, kind of gives you a background on the sort of things that go into administrators' roles in school finance elections. So obviously budgeting is a key factor, but it's also worth understanding those other unique factors that school finance plays. School funding obviously fails to keep up with inflation and growing populations, and it also creates new problems for administrators to have to take on those bigger scale projects, right? Why are our schools falling in disrepair? Well, frankly, it's because they have very little flexibility within their budget to pay for large scale upgrade or changes, right? So you're saying, Trenton, get to the point. How do these new facilities get built? It is through school finance elections. Every state has some mechanism, good typo right there, I'll fix that before it gets posted. Every state has some mechanism for which independent school districts can incur public debt to pay for projects. To incur this debt, school districts must create ballot measures to take out bonds to pay for those projects. Public bonds, school bonds, are large-scale debt that must be approved by voters that goes towards paying for capital projects exclusively. In something like the state of Colorado, bonds are only allowed to go towards capital funding, either the construction or renovation of existing facilities or operations and maintenance costs. If a bond is approved, great, money is fronted to the district, and the project will then be started based off of the way that the bond measure was written. And then they're paid back with interest by the district, generally through an increase to property taxes through a mill levy. In our current system, this is the only way for districts to receive massive one-time influxes of cash to fund projects outside of private donations, which occur at such a rare level that it's just not worth talking about systemically. You're not seeking out donations. But this massive influx of cash is the only way that you're going to pay for some of those larger capital projects. So what is the process for an administrator in a district to conduct a finance election? Well, the elected body must create and approve a ballot measure that clearly outlines the cost and specific uses for the funds for voters within its boundaries to approve. It has to be specific. These ballot measures have to outline exact costs and exact projects that they're going to be into, because you're taking out public debt, and so the public should have the ability to understand what that debt is going towards. Once approved by the district, they will then petition the county to add the ballot measure to the next election, whenever that may be. Often it's not natural petition. They don't actually have to go and collect signatures. It's a process that the county follows that has the same name. And the cost to petition, the research that goes into approving or creating the ballot measure, everything like that is all paid by the district and is not reimbursable through these bonds. Voters then have the opportunity to vote on potential bonds alongside the other elections happening concurrently. If a bond is passed, great, everything gets to go. If the bond isn't passed, no new debt is issued, but it does not preclude the district from the ability to take on to try again later. It can be the exact same measure with updated dates. That's absolutely possible. The failing of a measure is often more of a PR problem and a management problem than it is a legal problem with the elections process. So let me talk poli-sci a little bit. So as I talked a little bit about last week, my background, I studied PPA through a poli-sci department, so it was a little more academic. One of the benefits I got of that, though, is I do know a lot about elections and voters, right? And so let's talk about school finance election dynamics. People hate voting to raise their own taxes. Despite me yelling at a brick wall for hours and hours on end about how important taxes are to provide government services and education, people don't seem to listen. And generally, school finance elections have a below 50% success rate. That is increasing. The most recent election, the most recent election in 2021, we haven't had one yet in 2022, did have, in Colorado, more than 50% of their ballot measures be approved, exciting, but that success rate, whether or not those trends are changing, it has yet to be seen. Everyone in the district votes, meaning that even non-parents, people who may not have a direct vested interest in the school district, have the ability to vote on whether or not this debt needs to be incurred. And weirdly enough, there's research that suggests that turnout has a strong negative effect on the approval of measures, meaning the more people that vote, the less likely it is that a new school bond measure is going to pass. Bond elections do not have to happen concurrently with major elections like a presidential election, and every state and every county kind of sets their own schedules for when those elections occur. It can be on midterm years, it can be on off years like 2021, 2023. It can be in November, it can be in May. That's all set. Elections are administered at the local level, so all of that is set depending on where you go. So what we know is higher turnout means a less success rate for bond measures, meaning you probably don't want to put it on a ballot that's going to have a lot more people voting, like a presidential election. You probably want to shoot for one of those off years. But overall, community culture is the number one factor that impacts whether or not bond measures are approved. The community's beliefs about the school district, whether or not they like the school district and its management. What is the average median income of the district, and who are the community leaders that are talking about these sort of issues? These all change the dynamics of bond elections. What Leafdo and Senden do is create guides for administrators to navigate these dynamics. But what you see is that the deck is stacked against administrators in terms of taking out new debt. It requires a lot of strong leadership. It requires a lot of strategy and research in order to have a successful school bond election. So, what do administrators do when these bond elections happen? Obviously, it gets approved by the district and then goes up, and do they just sit back and kind of hope people approve it? Well, some of them do. Some of them believe ethically it's irresponsible for district administrators like superintendents to be involved in the political process. However, best practices, including recommendations from the Superintendents Association, say that taking a strong leadership role, engaging the community on in an election issue, is part of their job, and they should be taking affirmative steps to help pass the bond measures necessary to fund their schools. They're supposed to be champions and advocates. So let's talk about an advocate. So this is Dr. Matthew Mann. He was the superintendent for Pleasanton Independent School District. It's a relatively affluent, small community outside of San Antonio, Texas. Prior to serving as the superintendent of the district, he was the high school principal for 3 years, had more than a decade of in-classroom teaching experience in social studies and speech and debate. He also has his doctorate in education administration, a lot like we talked about with the superintendents, right? They have a higher level of expectation and training. He's also my uncle. Dr. Mann, when he was appointed superintendent, he undertook the district's first LRFP in more than a decade. They hadn't been doing it, and it put them in a pickle when it came to upgrading their facilities because no one really understood what facilities needed to be upgraded. But being the principal of the high school, Mann pretty much had looked into this and suspected what he ended up learning from this LRFP. And this is what Pleasanton needed, according to the LRFP, is a new elementary school, very specific, limited, targeted upgrades to the middle and high school, particularly their technology and their common areas, and a new STEM facility that was a strategic goal of the district. And it aligned a lot with the growing interest in this community. It's an agriculture community. It's in Texas, but there were more and more students interested in technology and STEM services, and so building a facility to not only meet the students where they are, but meet that strategic goal was something that was part of that LRFP. But Mann had a problem. Just LRFP, cool. In a ideal world, he conducts the LRFP. He says this is what we need. He figures out the cost and he goes and does it, right? But that's not the case. There was not the money available for that, so he faced a reality. When he was a principal, the community shot down a bond measure for very similar upgrades, including the new elementary school, in 2013, just a year before he was appointed. At that point, the community rejected the bond measure because they said the district didn't fully understand the needs of the schools. They hadn't conducted an LRFP, so they were probably not all that wrong. Led by the president of the Parent-Teacher Association, the community insisted they wanted a new high school and an ad facility. That was what they needed. That was what the community just said. This is what we need, and if you say otherwise, you just don't understand the schools very well, do you, Dr. Mann? So he was put in a bind. He did the research. He followed best practices, conducted a thorough analysis to determine what the needs of the district are, and the analysis fundamentally disagreed with what the community thought they needed themselves. This is a problem, right? The community has to approve this new bond measure. So Mann got to work as soon as he was appointed, engaging the community about a potential bond measure well before it would even be brought to the school board themselves. He both wanted to hear what the community thought about the school's capital assets, but he also wanted to communicate what his research had found. And through these community conversations, he communicated with me that the biggest need for the district was the high school. They still believe that the biggest need for the district was the high school, but it was not supported by the data. The way that administrators determine whether or not a new building is needed is that they use projected growth data, not current data. So even though you may think, hey, our high school is pretty full right now, you may not be projected to grow that student body, whereas the student body of elementary school students, such was the case with PISD, that's where the resources need to go towards. Moreover, when you're making these construction decisions, they're based off of capacity limits that may not be evident to the naked eye. Those capacity limits are set, they're standardized, there's safety issues, there's fire hazard issues, and it may look like a high school is more crowded than an elementary school. That does not mean that the high school is in more need than the elementary school. You have to follow those standards. Through these conversations, he concluded that the engaged members of the community, the same PTA president, were largely parents of middle and high school students. Thus, they had a vested interest in a new high school facility, right? Okay, that helps explain it a little bit, helped man understand the dynamics of his community. But he also knew that what the district needed was about $50 million in investment, which would already be the largest bond measure in the history of Atascosa County, which is the county that Pleasanton sits in. Convincing the school district to take out this bond was going to be difficult. And in my conversations with him, he outlined a couple of different dynamics that he had to contend with. Well, the first was that because the cost was so high, meaning there was more of a burden on him to convince the community that this was needed. The recent failed bond election made the community more engaged with this than they normally would be, and the issue was more salient. More people were already knowledgeable as they thought they were about the issue. And the community beliefs fundamentally misaligned with what the district actually needed. And so man had to do something to convince the community of what the district's needs actually were, because he did the data, he did the evidence-based research a la Honig and Coburg, and he said, this is what we need, and the community didn't agree with him. So, what do? Well, if you're Dr. Mann, you concoct a plan. That rhymed, bars. He knew that the LRFP itself was not sufficient to change the community's mind. You can't just run at people who are convinced otherwise, that the data says you're wrong. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. We, as PPA professionals, wish that's how it worked. It made our jobs a whole lot easier, but it's not. So, yeah, he put on his politician hat and went and sat down with the PTA president herself. The PTA president echoed the community's beliefs, and she also said that she believes that we are an ad-based community. We need a new 4-H agricultural sciences building in the district. So, man, though this was not the language he used at the time, he engaged in what we call log rolling in political science. Log rolling is the trading of interests to get support for each side. So, essentially what man did is he offered a deal to the PTA president. He said, what if, in the new bond, we include that new 4-H facility and some additional upgrades that maybe the LRFP didn't say we needed to the high school in exchange for the PTA president's explicit, consistent support for the new elementary school. He made a deal. He went to the community leader and said, this is what I can do for you. And she took it. Man took it to another community event, got a much more positive response, and so he took it to the district, the school district, and said, here's what we need to do. And great, Brilliant, awesome. It earned the support of the community and the school board. How great. The only problem is it added $13 million to its projection. So not only was it already going to be the largest in county history, now it was even larger, and it was more than $20 million higher than the failed bond not but 2 years prior in 2013. So man got to work, and he followed the directions of people like Lifto and Senden and did the legwork and took a strong leadership position, staked his career on the success of this bond. He was brand new. It was a risky proposition for his own personal career. Because he works at the pleasure of the school board, he could have been fired if that failed, and probably justifiably so. He put a lot of effort and a lot of district resources into this. And he got to work. He rolled up his sleeves, and by March 2015, when the election happened, all $63 million was approved by a 55 to 45% margin. And to date, since the approval, the new elementary school has been constructed, hosts a growing cohort of students, and they conducted another LRFP in 2019 and indicated that a new high school is needed in 2030, probably. They're going to probably need another elementary and middle school before a high school, but maybe they'll eventually get their new high school. So, what made Man's story so successful, and why I like telling this story, especially in this unit in particular, is that the administrator took an additional role that went beyond, I think, what you expect administrators to do. He really understands the district's needs because he had been a part of the district. He taught in the district, he was a principal in the district, but he also knew the community's needs as well. He paid attention at the previous election. He knew who were the loudest voices. He knew who was guiding the conversation. And despite what he professed to be a severe disdain for politics, because he was so dedicated to education, it allowed him to lead its district to the needed outcome. He didn't particularly care about the political dynamics. He knew that we could use a 4-H facility, even though it might not be necessary. And if it allows me to secure the money I need to make sure that our facilities are upkept and we get the new elementary school we need, it's a trade-off I'm willing to make. And it's also evident, and the other lesson from this is that even if you follow all of the best practice and do everything perfectly right, based off of your training, based off of what administrators believe is necessary, it does not guarantee the funding is necessary. That reliance creates such a unique dynamic for public schools. It's uniquely democratic in that when you need that debt and you do it and you say, man, we need the community on board. And that's a really cool, small d democratic thing to see. But it also massively handcuffs administrators just trying to do what's right for their district. So be thinking about what role administrators play in these elections and what role should they play. Do you think that ethically someone like Dr. Mann should have been engaged with this overall? What problems arise from relying on elections to fund school capital projects, right? And then how engaged do administrators need to be in a political conversation like that? And what issues may arise? Be thinking about things like our politics administration dichotomy, right? Yeah, someone like Dr. Mann as a superintendent kind of sits on the edge of that dichotomy, sits in both worlds, but is an administrator to his core. And so there are issues dipping your feet into politics. Like I said, he really put his career on the line for it because he did get so engaged with the election. He tied himself to it, and it ended up working out. But be thinking about those questions. Be thinking about that as you review Lifto and Senden, and as you start thinking about the evidence-based actions in Honed and Coburn. God, I'm never going to be able to say that. Honed and Coburn. Be thinking about that as we go along. I do want to point out that I was scheduled to teach this class last spring, but it got postponed to the fall and then got postponed again to the summer. I was going to interview Dr. Mann. I had an entire plan worked out with him, and unfortunately he did pass away last November. He was 49. When I spoke at the beginning of this class and in my retrospective about my family's connection to the public education system. My uncle was the pinnacle of that. He was someone who was so incredibly dedicated to his craft. And he received the recognition and accolades he deserved. Not when that bond measure passed, the Chamber of Commerce and President named him Man of the Year. He was recently, unfortunately posthumously, but recently inducted into Adams State, which is where he went to for his undergrad, for his teaching license, into their Education Hall of Fame, which was really cool. And if you are interested, I did write something for our local paper, both where he and my dad grew up and where my brothers grew up, talking about him. I'm teaching this class in his honor. I wish I could have been teaching this class with his direct support, but I'm teaching it in his honor. And so you probably saw scattered throughout this. It said Pride, Pride everywhere. This was Pleasanton High School. They were the Eagles, and at football games, at graduations, at everything that he went to, there was the chant where he would say Pride, Pride, and then the entire crowd would say Eagle Pride. So that's why you're seeing that everywhere. I learned so much from him in terms of what it takes to be a good school district administrator. And I mean, he was so incredibly knowledgeable and so incredibly invested in the success of his school district that I am just in awe of it, and he is the gold standard when it comes to administrators. So I digress. This is the end of week 8. Man, I copy it over and I change everything and then didn't change the lead. So it's the end of week 8. Honage and Coburn is your reading response. Again, super, way more straightforward prompt. It's also due on Sundays. Thank you to whoever provided that feedback in the survey. Making things due on Sunday. Honestly, not even something I thought about being an issue. Super easy fits. I'm so glad. I've heard that would be helpful for at least some of you. So I'm happy to make that change. Reading list, like I said, I'm trying to lighten the reading load a little bit. Leafto and Sendin, school report card, Hosford, Honage and Coburn is always obviously on there as well. But be on the lookout next week after the 4th of July. The rubric for the description rubric for the final project will be released, as well as a video where I'm going to talk about that rubric. I'm going to also talk about what is expected and what the purpose of that project is overall. I've spoken to all of you. All of you have really excellent ideas for your project, and I think they're all going to be super successful. I, as of recording, have not yet reviewed all of your project proposals, but you've all met with me, so I have nothing but the utmost confidence that you're going to do great. Please stay safe. Please let me know if there's any support or anything you need. Office hours next week. Tuesday office hours will be canceled. I do have a doctor's appointment. Wednesday office hours will still be on. But I do have the ability to work around your schedules. If you do need to meet at some other point, I'm happy to do that. So I want to say, once again, I'm very grateful for your support, for your feedback. I've really thoroughly enjoyed this class so far, and I really think we're just, as we near the end of this class, we're just going to have more and more cool things to talk about, and I can't wait to hear all of your thoughts and learn so much from you guys as well. So we'll talk to you soon.